For if the dead are not raised, then neither has Christ been raised. The belief that the dead can rise from their dreamless slumbers to once again walk the land of the living, known more succinctly as resurrection, predates the most famous resurrection story of all time by certainly thousands of years, as do the debates about whether a resurrection is even possible. The ancient Greeks generally denied the concept of a physical resurrection, even though several characters from their mythologies, such as Asclepius, Achilles, Castor, Alcmene, Heracles, and Melicertes, were raised from the dead and deified or made immortal, like the gods. According to the book of Acts, when Paul tries to convince a group of Greeks in Athens that Jesus had been raised from the dead, Paul gets the cold shoulder from most of them. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, "We shall hear you again concerning this." It wasn't that they had anything against Jesus. Most had never heard of him, but the idea of coming back to life after the body had decomposed was simply a ridiculous proposition to them. I can almost hear them muttering, "Oh, great, the old decomposed corpse come to life claim again." Even among the Jews of Jesus' day, there were those who did not believe that the resurrection was even possible. Then the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. The question the Sadducees posed to Jesus concerned the precise nature of the afterlife and how the personal relationships held during life would translate into the hereafter. For example, if a woman was married 7 times during her life, who would be her husband in the afterlife? Inquisitive bunch, those Sadducees. In the middle of the 3rd century CE, an early Christian apologist named Origen wrote a quite lengthy work called Contra Celsus, or Against Celsus, which was a direct response to a writing by Celsus called The True Word. Celsus was a staunch critic of Christianity and the general idea of resurrection as well. Ironically, his work is preserved only in the larger work that attacks it. What they say of a land which is better and more excellent than this has been borrowed from certain divine ancient writers, and chiefly from Plato. Their ridiculous teaching on the subject of the resurrection is derived from what they have heard on the doctrine from Plato, jumbled and misconstrued. They uphold this doctrine in order that they may see and know God. So, it seems I'm arriving a tad late to this debate, but I'd like to propose the idea that we can now present evidence that was simply not available to our ancient ancestors, by which we might conclude beyond a reasonable doubt not that the resurrection of Jesus most likely did occur, but that beyond a reasonable doubt, the resurrection of Jesus most likely never occurred. You might be surprised to hear that I won't claim that a resurrection of the dead cannot have ever occurred or can never occur in the future. If a God does exist and decided to raise anyone from the dead, it seems logical to think that this could take place, especially if the God in question was able to simply speak matter into existence and create an entire universe from scratch in less than 144 hours. But then if a God did intervene in the natural workings of the universe and alter the rules of physics it would then be classified as a miracle, and arguably the least likely thing to occur, but not impossible. However, this would entail the existence of a God, and in the case of Jesus' resurrection, not just any God. It would mean the existence of one particular God, the God of the Bible. And as far as I can tell, this is itself a most improbable thing. Renowned biblical scholar Bart Ehrman argues that based upon the New Testament, we simply cannot know or even be remotely confident that the resurrection of Jesus was in fact a historical event. Ehrman says that the evidence we do have is unreliable and hearsay at best. But unlike Ehrman, I will argue not only that there is no good evidence to support the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus, but that given what we now know about the New Testament, Christian origins, and science, there is actually strong evidence against the resurrection of Jesus. Short of loud trumpets, descending angels, and a flaming sword of judgment, or maybe a time machine, our examination of the resurrection of Jesus will always remain incomplete and will ultimately end in some kind of vague probability between 1 and 0. Somewhere between 0, impossible, and 1, it happened. I won't actually provide a number because I don't think it's possible to assess the probability for this alleged event. A historical event in antiquity can never be proven or disproven like a math theorem. But it might be possible to make an overwhelming case for or against an event to the point that there are no reasonable doubts as to the conclusion drawn from the available evidence. This is where I intend to go. I will attempt to show beyond a reasonable doubt that the resurrection of Jesus did not occur. Our first stop is a fairly thorough look at the idea that an account of the post-resurrection appearances by Jesus was never part of the original gospel story. I'll use the traditional authorship when referring to the Gospels as a matter of convenience in this video series, even though the Gospels were written anonymously. Most scholars believe that Mark is the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels. Why this is so is beyond the scope of this video series, but many scholars also believe, as I do, that the original story of the escapades of Jesus in Palestine, the Gospel of Mark, never contained any post-resurrection details as found in the majority of later gospel manuscripts. What evidence could we lay on the proverbial table that would support the claim that the last 12 verses were never part of the original Gospel of Mark? This is Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century Bible and the earliest complete Bible in existence. If we look at the 16th chapter of Mark, we notice something very strange. It ends at verse 8. Verses 9 through 20, as found in the King James translation, and many other translations, are missing from this copy of Mark. This is Codex Vaticanus, another 4th century Bible. If we locate the last chapter of Mark in this codex, we also run into the same problem. Verses 9 through 20, the ones that show Jesus appearing to the women and disciples and giving the Great Commission and making promises about drinking poison with no ill effects, are all missing from this early Bible. Another manuscript, Minuscule 304, a 12th century manuscript containing Mark, also ends at verse 8. The late 4th century Codex Syriac Sinaiticus also ends at verse 8. The 2 oldest Georgian manuscripts, circa 7th century, end at verse 8 as well. The old Latin Codex, Babiensis, is also missing verses 9 through 20. One Sahidic manuscript ends at verse 8 as well, as do about 100 Armenian copies. The church father Origen who lived in the early 3rd century, quotes from the post-resurrection accounts of Matthew, Luke, and John, but not from Mark, or any of the other endings to Mark. Eusebius, considered to be the church historian, living in the 4th century, writes in a reply to a question regarding a difference between the longer ending of Mark and the account in Matthew, that a possible solution to the discrepancy is to realize that almost all the copies of Mark known to him were missing verses 9 through 20, and that if one counts this ending as spurious, the discrepancy between the two Gospels is solved. Quoting Eusebius, "For the one who sets aside the passage itself, verses 9 through 20, the pericope that says this might say that it is not extant in all the copies of the Gospel according to Mark. The accurate ones of the copies, at least, circumscribe the end of the history according to Mark in the words of the young man seen by the women who said to them, 'Do not fear, you seek Jesus the Nazarene, and those that follow,' to which it further says, 'And having heard, they fled, and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.' For in this manner, the ending of the Gospel according to Mark is circumscribed almost in all the copies." Jerome, another church father and the creator of the Latin version of the Bible, the Vulgate, also attests to the fact that almost all of the copies of Mark he had seen did not contain verses 9 through 20. Quoting Jerome, "Of which question the solution is twofold. For either we do not receive the testimony of Mark, which is extant in rare Gospels, almost all of the Greek books not having this chapter at the end, especially since it looks like it narrates things diverse from and contrary to certain evangelists." An interesting fact is that more of the copies of Mark that were circulating in the western regions of the Mediterranean had the longer ending, while most of those circulating in the eastern regions did not. This makes perfect sense and is quite analogous to species of animals becoming varied by means of geographical separation, and in this case, the geographical separation was the Mediterranean Sea. Once several copies of Mark gained the long ending, they would have begun to multiply in the region that gave birth to the long ending, while the other region remained relatively similar to the original version, but as more time passed, the longer ending became favored once it crossed the sea, but it would take many centuries before that happened, as evidenced by the testimonies of Eusebius and Jerome. Several copies of Mark that do have the longer ending are denoted with either an asterisk or other notation, which normally meant that the verses in question were in debate or questionable at the time the manuscript copy was made. In other words, the copyist had at least one copy of Mark without the verses and one with. What's a copyist to do? It's obvious. Use the longer ending and denote the discrepancy with an asterisk or other symbol. The New Living Translation even states in a footnote that the earliest copies of Mark do not contain anything beyond chapter 16, verse 8. The most reliable early manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark end at verse 8. Other manuscripts include various endings to the Gospel. A few include both the shorter ending and the longer ending. The majority of manuscripts include the longer ending immediately after verse 8. Another reason to doubt the authenticity of verses 9 through 20 is that they contradict Mark's original gospel. Where the original has the tomb empty, with no appearance by Jesus and the women telling no one about it, the resurrection accounts added to Mark show the women telling the disciples about the empty tomb with Jesus appearing to the women and to various people at various times. Also, verses 9 through 20, or the long ending as it's called, radically break the train of thought at verse 8. Verse 9 begins more like a completely new chapter rather than a continuation of verse 8. Another clue that these verses, as well as the other endings, were never part of the original Gospel of Mark is that the writing style of the long ending isn't the same as what is found throughout the rest of Mark's Gospel. Here are some words found in verses 9 through 20 that are found nowhere else in the Gospel of Mark. The word translated as deadly in verse 18 occurs nowhere else in the New Testament, and the phrase "them that had been with him" occurs nowhere else in the New Testament as a term referring to the disciples. Another interesting fact about the long ending is that it obsessively stresses the importance of believing in Jesus while promising condemnation to those who don't believe. In just the span of 12 verses, the importance of belief and the dire consequences of disbelief are mentioned no less than 7 times, while in the entire rest of the Gospel, a full 16 chapters, the concept is mentioned just 11 times. An interesting piece of trivia is that the Gospel of Mark in its modern form contains 678 verses. If one were to subtract the longer ending from Mark, verses 9 through 20, or in other words, 12 verses, it would leave 666 verses in the original Gospel of Mark. Although it's often said that 616 was the original number of the beast, it still looks pretty scary, doesn't it? And lastly, it's a well-established fact that later copies of a story, almost without exception, are longer and more detailed. And this is because they get embellished and added to over time, and Mark's story is no exception. With the original gospel story employing such an unresolved ending, and having no appearances by Jesus to anyone after his resurrection, future authors found this ending less than satisfying and set out to write their own, appending their own versions to the existing tale and passing their copy onward. Not only did Matthew likely misunderstand the classic literary techniques Mark was employing, but it was common in ancient times for stories to become embellished and grow in both length and detail before being passed on to the next generation of readers, who were sometimes authors themselves, who would make new edits and new additions and pass their copy onward. It is common for later copies of a story to be longer and more fleshed out, having more details than earlier versions, and the obvious reason is that the original had been added to and embellished with fictional elements at a later time by someone other than the original author. A young lad in Mark turns into an angel in Matthew. A stone already rolled away in Mark becomes one rolled away by the angel, accompanied by a great earthquake. The absence of guards at the tomb in Mark becomes an occasion for embellishment by the pen of Matthew, and so on. For these reasons, we can conclude with great confidence that Mark's original story ended at verse 8 and contained no post-resurrection appearances or other details beyond the women finding the empty tomb. It stands to reason, then, that if Mark knew enough details about Jesus' resurrection to write about the women reaching the tomb and actually record verbatim the conversation between them and the young lad in the tomb, he would have certainly included the post-resurrection details we find in other Gospels had he known about them. But allow me to speculate for a moment. What if Mark was not writing a historical account at all? Assume just for a moment that Mark was not writing of events that actually happened, but was instead writing fiction. A story about the heavenly Jesus brought down to earth to play the literal role that he played in heaven. What if Mark wanted to end his tale with more of a cliffhanger ending? Did the women ever tell the disciples? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? Did Jesus ever meet the disciples again? What happened to Judas? This ending is the type that makes you want to buy the sequel. And sure enough, people started writing the sequel on their own. Since Mark never contained a post-resurrection story beyond verse 8, this calls into question all of the other post-resurrection accounts. There are several reasons for this. First of all, the other Gospels stick closely to Mark's version of the resurrection from verses 1 through 8, often verbatim in places, then diverge widely after that. Next, even if Mark had never acquired embellishment to the resurrection account, the problem of how Matthew and Luke and John could know details that Mark did not know still exists. It's a far-fetched notion that claims that 40 years after Jesus' death, Mark would know intimate details of the women visiting the tomb, but would not have known of details occurring moments after that, those of Jesus' appearances and sayings. Yet, Matthew, writing perhaps even decades after Mark, and copying Mark verbatim in large amounts, would somehow have known about these details. But of course, the simple explanation that Matthew copied Mark and simply altered it to improve upon it from a theological standpoint answers all of the problems we find between the two accounts with one deft stroke. Since Mark could not have penned his gospel any earlier than 70 CE, check out my video series on dating the New Testament to see why this is true. The obvious implication is that there was no tradition at all as late as 40 years after Jesus' death regarding anything that happened beyond the women finding the empty tomb. Surely all of this points to the conclusion that all of the post-resurrection accounts in all four Gospels, including the various endings found in the various manuscripts of Mark, are fictional embellishments to Mark's original story. The very existence of multiple endings to Mark that we find in existing manuscript copies proves that Mark's story was being embellished by many different authors shortly after it began to gain circulation. The idea that people were simply summarizing Matthew's account by removing details such as the earthquake and the Roman soldiers and demoting the angel to a simple lad in white clothing is, shall we say, less than persuasive. It makes sense that by the time Matthew got his copy of Mark, verses 9 through 20, or the longer ending, had not yet been inserted, since Matthew's version diverges greatly at that point. Certainly, if it had been in Mark's copy, Matthew would have copied it, just like he did verses 1 through 8 of chapter 16. But Matthew didn't just add details to Mark's gospel, he edited and modified them to create his own improved version. A quick comparison of the speech given by the angel, or boy, depending on which version you prefer, will show beyond any reasonable doubt Matthew's dependence upon Mark's original text. And he said to them, "But the angel said to the women, 'Do not be amazed. Do not be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. You seek Jesus who was crucified. He has risen, he is not here. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. See the place where they laid him. Come see the place where he lay. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, as he told you. There you will see him. Lo, I have told you.'" Can there be any doubt that Matthew was copying the text of Mark's Gospel? Matthew retains many phrases verbatim, but rearranges them and embellishes them as well. Now, one might rightly ask, so what? What if the post-resurrection accounts we find in all four Gospels are merely fictional embellishments to the original Gospel story of Mark? What about the claim in chapter 16 that the tomb was, in fact, empty, and that Jesus had, in fact, risen from the dead? Can we not rely on Mark's claim since those verses are part of Mark's original writing? In short, no, and there are several reasons why. First, and hopefully obviously, it is foolish to simply rely on someone's claim that something unbelievable happened without also having at least some evidence to support it other than the claim itself. To simply trust an anonymous author's 2,000-year-old claim at face value about an event so unusual as to need a special word to define it, the word miracle, is worse than believing in Santa Claus just because your parents told you. At least you know your parents. No one knows who wrote the Gospel of Mark. But even if we granted that the author was reliably accurate in his account being a misnomer, and further, his details are often in conflict with historical and geographical facts, we have nothing better than hearsay. Period. We have nothing better than any of the other claims of resurrection offered by all other ancient cultures. We have no hard evidence that there even was an empty tomb, much less that someone came back from the dead and walked out of one. But more about the empty tomb later. In the next several videos, I'm going to explore this wild speculation of mine, that Mark was not writing history at all, but was indeed writing a deliberate work of fiction. Let me rewind back to that wild speculation of mine from the previous video, that Mark was writing a deliberate work of fiction. Why this has a bearing on the resurrection question should be obvious. If Mark's story is fictional, and the other three Gospels derive from Mark's tale, then we have eliminated all four Gospels from the equation, which then leaves the other New Testament writings, such as Paul's letters and so forth. But the question we all need to ask when any supposedly far-fetched conclusion such as this is presented is, what evidence can we lay on the table to support this claim? Is there anything of substance that we could present that would show beyond a reasonable doubt that Mark was writing fiction? Funny you should ask. One piece of evidence that supports this idea is that Mark, the earliest gospel, has all the earmarks of a work of fiction. It's written in the third person with an omniscient narrator. One good example of the fictional nature of Mark is when Mark recounts Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Everyone present who could have heard what Jesus prayed was allegedly asleep. How did Mark know what Jesus said if everyone was asleep? It's the omniscient narrator at work. The author of a work of fiction always knows what his characters are thinking and doing at all times. Mark also contains literary techniques and motifs, and its form matches a specific type of ancient fiction known as a hero biography. This was a common form of fiction in the Greco-Roman world. The Odyssey by Homer is a perfect example of this. The hero, Odysseus, goes on many adventures and undergoes many trials and sufferings, and eventually comes out victorious. But an even stronger piece of evidence that Mark has given us a fictional tale is that Mark has not just framed the life of Jesus as a hero biography, similar to the Odyssey, but has actually drawn details and motifs directly from Homer's Odyssey. Mark also draws from the Greek mythologies, The Greek translation of the Jewish Old Testament known as the Septuagint, as well as contemporary traditions about Jesus in order to form scenes in his own mini-epic. Just as Homer wrote of the adventures of Odysseus and his crew members, Mark has penned some amazing adventures of Jesus and his disciples, with a little help from Homer. And Mark has cleverly hidden some flags inside his work to alert the more astute readers of his day to what he had done. We might be tempted to call this a tip of the hat to Homer, except that Mark has not just taken a bit here or there. He's used the Odyssey as a kind of blueprint which guides his own story in not only the huge sweeping motifs, but unusual details as well. Rewriting a previous story and changing the characters was a common practice in more ancient times, long before the idea of copyright. The works of Homer had been in circulation roughly 800 years by the time Mark penned his story, and these Greek tales were well known by anyone educated in reading and writing Greek, as Mark clearly was. By Mark's day, Homer was in the air, so to speak. Not only are these parallels numerous, they are also unusual in character and carry astonishing explanatory power regarding many of the enigmatic passages we find in Mark. The thesis that Mark used scenes and concepts from Homer actually explains many of the oddities we find in Mark, which seem to defy explanation, such as the naked young man running away from Jesus, why Jesus would curse a fig tree out of season, why Jesus was crucified between two criminals and not on either side of them, why the feeding of the 5,000 entailed only male guests, why the chief priest needed Judas to identify Jesus when Jesus had been debating the chief priest in the temple and showing himself publicly on many occasions, why Jesus made such a big deal over keeping his identity secret through the entire gospel, why he traveled by ship so often in Mark, but not in the other three gospels, why James and John are treated as veritable Siamese twins with no volition of their own, and why Jesus renamed them to the Sons of Thunder, how an anonymous woman would gain worldwide fame, and so on. So, buckle your seatbelts and no smoking. We're about to go where no resurrection debate video has gone before. In the previous video, I made the claim that Mark's Gospel was a deliberate work of fiction, based in part on Homer's Odyssey. Now, it's time to put my money where my mouth is. We'll spotlight some basic parallels first, and before we're done, we'll examine several of them in great detail. Keep in mind that it's perfectly normal to be skeptical, but, like a good juror, please try to keep an open mind until all of the evidence has been presented. And that's going to take several videos to accomplish. In the Odyssey, we learn that Odysseus is a man who will undergo many sufferings, be set upon by rivals in his homeland, visit Hades, the land of the dead, and return alive to tell about it. Odysseus's future sufferings are foretold by Calypso, as she tries to tempt him into abandoning his quest and staying with her to rule as an immortal. But if you only knew in your own heart how many hardships you were fated to undergo before getting back to your country, you would stay here with me and be the lord of this household and be an immortal. Although Odysseus finds Calypso more beautiful than his wife Penelope, he longs to return to his wife and his homeland of Ithaca. What I want and all my days I pine for is to go back to my house and see my day of homecoming, and if some god batters me far out on the wine-blue water, I will endure it, keeping a stubborn spirit inside me. For already I have suffered much, and done much hard work on the waves and in the fighting, so let this adventure follow." Odysseus says that no matter what hardships may follow, he will endure them in order to get back home. This reminds me somewhat of Jesus' resolve in the Gethsemane scene. No matter if the hardship is even death, Jesus was resolved to go through with it to get back to his heavenly home and to accomplish God's plan of salvation. In Mark, we have Jesus predicting his own hardships and suffering, and like Odysseus, Jesus would visit the land of the dead and make it home alive. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected of the elders and of the chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Here, Mark not only used a parallel theme, but he has improved upon it, for even after dying, Jesus will come back from the land of the dead, as Odysseus had returned alive from Hades, the Greek land of the dead. We will continue to see Mark improve the scenes and motifs he copies from the Odyssey, as this was one goal of the fiction writers of ancient times, mimesis with an eye toward improving upon the previous tale. Now, some of you may have been thinking to yourselves, these basic parallels are okay, but not completely convincing. Where's the beef? Well, to those of you who are hankering for something a bit more filling, I hope you brought an appetite and some steak sauce. In the Odyssey, Odysseus' identity is often cloaked so that his friends and family don't even know who he is, even though they are speaking directly to him. This hidden identity technique is a recurring motif in the Odyssey, and of course, it's merely a literary technique employed to create irony. The reader knows full well who Odysseus is, but the people inside Homer's story with whom he is interacting do not. In one of the most memorable scenes in the Odyssey, Odysseus, disguised as a beggar, enters his own home, and his old nurse, Euryclea, begins washing him. She thinks he is just a beggar until she notices the scar, which allows her to recognize the stranger as her master Odysseus. She is so overjoyed that she wants to tell Penelope that her husband has returned, but Odysseus warns her not to tell anyone. "My good mother, why this wish to have me slaughtered? You yourself nursed me at this breast of yours. Now in the 20th year, after undergoing numerous ordeals, I've come back to my native land, and now you've recognized me. A god has put that in your heart. Stay silent, so in these halls no one else finds out." I'd like you to keep a couple of things in mind as we examine Mark's use of Homer's hero in disguise construct. The basic construct is this: a disguised hero interacts with friends and strangers, and when he is recognized by someone, he warns them to be silent and tell no one else of his true identity. The implication is that if he is found out prematurely, the hero will be placed in some kind of special danger. In Mark, Jesus' identity as the Son of God is hidden from the other characters, and even from his own followers for a while, even though Jesus is speaking directly to the Jewish leaders who are analogous to the suitors in the Odyssey. They do not recognize him as the Son of God. This creates irony. Just imagine the Christian readers of Mark's day and how they must have smiled to think of the Jewish leaders trying to lecture the very Son of God about the Mosaic laws. That's irony, and as we shall soon find out, Mark takes Homer's hidden identity technique to its limit. In several passages, Jesus tries to maintain his secrecy by telling those whom he healed not to mention the miracle to anyone. And he sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone." And immediately the girl got up and walked. She was 12 years of age. and they were immediately overcome with amazement, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this. Mark makes Jesus command everyone to keep mum about his true identity so that Mark can have ample opportunity to employ irony throughout his tale. Once Jesus' identity gets out, the irony from that technique is lost for the rest of the tale. And with overly contrived adherence to the hidden identity theme from the Odyssey, Jesus even commands the demons to be mute, lest they blurt out his true identity to everyone and derail Mark's irony machine. What business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. And Jesus rebuked him, saying, Be quiet, and come out of him. And he healed many who were ill with various diseases, and cast out many demons. And he was not permitting the demons to speak, because they knew who he was. Whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they would fall down before him and shout, You are the Son of God! And he earnestly warned them not to tell who he was. Earnestly warned the demons? I would have thought that the very Son of God would be able to simply shut the demons up if he truly didn't want his identity leaking out. Further, what difference would it make if people knew he was the Son of God? Isn't that what you want to happen? Wouldn't that help people to believe in him? Wouldn't that have helped spread the news of his miraculous advent worldwide? All of this secrecy seems a bit too contrived, until we realize that Mark was superimposing the hidden identity motif from Homer's Odyssey onto his own fiction, and oftentimes it just doesn't work quite as well. Jesus earnestly warning the demons not to tell people who he really was? Come on, man. Then, after 8 chapters of miracles, teachings, and parables, Jesus asks his disciples who people think he is, and then who they think he is. Peter finally manages to put the pieces together and says, You are the Christ. Well, duh. And immediately, what does Jesus warn them not to do? And he warned them to tell no one about him. But as a quick aside, let me hearken back to Odysseus' warning to Euryclea. Do you remember how Odysseus said that a god had put her recognition of him in her heart? That is precisely what Jesus says to Peter in Matthew's version. Simon Peter answered, You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus replied, Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. Is it possible that Matthew also knew of Homer and was using the Odyssey to actually embellish Mark's version? Just more food for thought, and this is not the only instance where Matthew does embellish with details from Homer, but let's get back to Mark. In the 7th chapter of Mark, Jesus heals a deaf man with a speech impediment by putting his fingers in his ears and spitting, then touching the man's tongue and saying the magical phrase, Be opened. I was almost expecting open sesame, but anyway. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And in the very next verse, what do you think Jesus warns them not to do? And he charged them to tell no one. You see, if Jesus' true identity got out, it would destroy all future chances for ironic encounters in Mark's story. So Mark must maintain Jesus' secret identity at every turn in order to increase the number of ironic encounters. Then we come to Jesus' transfiguration. And after 6 days, Jesus took Peter and James and John and led them up onto a high mountain, apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. After the transfiguration, take a wild guess at what Jesus warns James, John, and Peter not to do. As they were coming down from the mountain, he gave them orders not to relate to anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man rose from the dead. By now, you should be able to see the fictional nature of this deliberate effort by Mark to keep Jesus' identity a secret. Mark wants to keep the secrecy going for the length of his story, or at least until Jesus explicitly spills the beans in front of the high priest. And by maintaining Jesus' secrecy, like in Homer's Odyssey, at the expense of clear contrivance, it buys Mark the maximum amount of ironic encounters. At every turn, the disciples, the Jewish leaders, the general populace are asking themselves, "Who is this man?" Of course, the reader knows, and was no doubt reading along thinking to themselves, I know who he is." The hidden identity motif remains in place until Jesus finally lets the cat out of the bag in front of the head Jewish religious leader, but the secret Mark's readers already knew created the same effects between Jesus and the Pharisees as it did in the Odyssey between Odysseus and his antagonists. If the suitors in the Odyssey had only known they were talking to the guy whose house they were currently in and trashing, if the Jewish leaders had only known they were talking to the very Son of God and trying to lecture him on the Mosaic Law, we can clearly see the fictional transparency of this literary technique borrowed from Homer and religiously employed, excuse the pun, by Mark for the sole purpose of creating irony, just as Homer did. This also explains a particular plot hole in Mark's story: why the chief priests needed help in identifying Jesus when Jesus had been appearing openly in public and debating the Jewish leaders in the synagogues. And he went into their synagogues throughout all Galilee, preaching and casting out demons. Odysseus cloaks his identity on many occasions, and he is then able to eavesdrop and hear what others truly say about him. But this is unnecessary when it comes to the suitors of Penelope, the guys ransacking Odysseus's home, because Odysseus has been gone for years, and they had no idea what he looked like, and even uncloaked would need someone to inform them of his identity. The suitors in the Odyssey are analogous to the Pharisees and Jewish high priest in Mark's Gospel, the enemy, as it were. The suitors had no way of identifying Odysseus without help, and likewise, though Jesus allegedly appeared in the synagogues and preached in front of everyone openly, the Jewish leaders still needed a bit of help in identifying Jesus. This obvious plot hole was caused by Mark taking the hidden identity motif of Homer a bit too far in his zeal to improve upon the master. In the next few videos, we'll look at some more basic parallels as well as show how Mark's reliance upon the Odyssey and Greek mythology illuminates some oddities found in Mark, which both Matthew and Luke chose not to include in their rewrites. We'll also examine several of these parallels in great detail. So come hungry and get here early. The main course is yet to come. As in the last video, I want to look at some more basic parallels between Mark's Gospel and Homer's Odyssey, but this time, I want to examine one parallel in detail first that might just cause the more skeptical among you to at least scratch your collective chins. In the Odyssey, Odysseus encounters many supernatural foes and overcomes them. One of the supernatural foes Odysseus encounters is the giant Cyclops Polyphemus, who lives in a cave by the sea. Odysseus arrives by boat and takes 12 of his best men with him to the cave of the Cyclops, but he tells the rest of his men in his other ships to stay in the ships and wait. Odysseus is hoping to find hospitality, but instead, the Cyclops captures Odysseus and his men. Polyphemus kills several of them and eats a few in the process. The Cyclops then gets drunk with wine and asks Odysseus what his name is. Odysseus replies, "Nobody." Odysseus then blinds Polyphemus, and the Cyclops cries out, "Help! Nobody is harming me! Nobody is harming me!" Well, obviously, his Cyclops buddies don't come to his rescue because nobody's harming him. Later, Odysseus and his men escape by riding on the underside of the Cyclops' sheep, and once back in his ship, Odysseus taunts the Cyclops verbally by telling him he is not nobody, but Odysseus, king of Ithaca. This story from the Odyssey was known by anyone living in the first century who could read and write Greek, and certainly Mark would fall in that category as well. Homer's tale was widely known, but the question still remains: did Mark borrow from the Cyclops story in order to write one of the memorable scenes in his own epic adventure? Let's compare the account of the demon-possessed man to the Cyclops story, and you decide. Like Odysseus, Jesus sailed in a ship accompanied with other ships. He had a crew of men, and they sailed to a distant land, and in fact, Mark even says it's a distant country called Gadarenes. And like Odysseus, Jesus' men stay in the ship while he disembarks. But in this case, Jesus alone goes to face the danger. Again, Mark has depicted Jesus as greater than Odysseus by altering Homer's story. Odysseus had 12 men with him when he faced his danger, but Jesus would face his danger alone. Jesus finds a man coming out of the tombs who is possessed by demons, a supernatural foe as was Odysseus' adversary. It is interesting that Mark places the man inside tombs, which is very much like a cave, a carved-out place large enough to walk into. And as in Homer's story, where Polyphemus asks Odysseus his name, we see that this request for a name has been retained in Mark's version, yet inverted. In Mark, it is Jesus asking the monster for its name. And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" The demons reply, "Legion, for we are many," which is another wordplay just like nobody was in Homer's tale of the Cyclops. Mark has again retained what he copied from Homer and inverted it or altered it to improve upon his predecessor. Whereas nobody is equal to 0 men, Mark's legion is equal to 2,000 men, the number of men in a Roman legion. Jesus defeats the demons as Odysseus defeated the Cyclops, and once again, Mark retains a rather unique part of the story, an escape by riding a herd of animals. Yet once again, Mark inverts his source by having the demons ride away inside the body of pigs, whereas Odysseus' men escaped by riding on the underside of a herd of sheep. Jesus leaves the scene by ship, just as Odysseus did, and just after entering the ship, like Odysseus, Jesus calls back to the man on the shore. But instead of taunting him, as Odysseus did, Jesus tells the man to proclaim the good things God has done for him, yet another improvement by Mark upon Homer's original hero. Whereas Odysseus succumbed to pride and arrogance upon departing by declaring his kingship to the Cyclops, Jesus did not proclaim his own kingship or identity, but instead gave the credit to God. Now, let's put the main points from both scenes on the screen in the order in which they occur so we can better tell if there's anything to this strange coincidence of details between Homer's fiction and Mark's history. Odysseus sails with several ships and with a crew of men to a distant land, the land of the Cyclops. Jesus sails with several ships and a crew of men to a distant land, the land of the Gadarenes. Odysseus disembarks and tells all but 12 of his crew to stay in the ships. Jesus disembarks and goes alone, while all 12 of his crew members remain in the ship. Odysseus immediately meets the Cyclops Polyphemus in a cave. Jesus immediately meets a man possessed by demons coming out of a cave or a tomb. The Cyclops asks Odysseus his name. Jesus asked the demon-possessed man his name. Odysseus says his name is nobody, a clear wordplay. The demons tell Jesus their name is Legion, a clear wordplay. Odysseus blinds the Cyclops, thus defeating him. Jesus sends the demons from the man, thus defeating them. Odysseus and his remaining men escape by riding on the underside of sheep. The demons escape the man by riding inside of pigs. Odysseus and his men enter the ship again. Jesus enters his ship. Odysseus calls back to the shore and taunts the Cyclops. Jesus calls back to the shore, but does not reveal his true identity or take the credit. The number of parallels between the Cyclops tale and the tale of the demon-possessed man are many, and they are unique as well as sequential. What seals the deal for me is the uniqueness of the two parallels, the request for a name, which results in an obvious wordplay by the author, and the escape sequence of riding in or under a herd of animals. Is this just mere coincidence? Or was Mark trying to hit a homer? Okay, let's finish up this vid with a look at a few more basic parallels. In the Odyssey, Odysseus meets a dead prophet named Tiresias while he's in Hades, the Greek notion of an underworld. In Mark, Jesus meets two dead prophets, Elijah and Moses, and again Mark tries to improve upon the Odyssey because Jesus doesn't go to them, they come to Jesus. In the Odyssey, Odysseus eats a last supper with his comrades in the halls of the witch Circe before going down to Hades. In Mark, Jesus and his comrades eat a last supper before Jesus departs into the land of the dead. In the Odyssey, all of Odysseus's crew members die, and only Odysseus survives. In Mark, the author has inverted this, and all of Jesus's crew members survive while Jesus dies. Only later does Judas kill himself in remorse, but Mark again improves upon Homer, for his hero is depicted as greater than Odysseus, for he survived not only his trials and tribulations, but death itself. Now, the last thing I want to look at before I wrap this video up is another sweeping motif that pervades both the Odyssey and Mark's story. In the Odyssey, Odysseus's travels are almost always accommodated by ship, ending at some adventure once disembarking. He also takes 12 shipmates from his fleet into the cave of Polyphemus, as we looked at earlier. In Mark, we learn that Jesus apparently traveled frequently by ship, and in fact, did this more in Mark's tale than either Matthew's or Luke's. And of course, Jesus has 12 shipmates. And he spoke to his disciples that a small ship should wait on him because of the multitude, lest they should throng him. And he began again to teach by the seaside, and there was gathered unto him a great multitude, so that he entered into a ship, and sat in the sea. And the whole multitude was by the sea on the land. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. And there were also with him other little ships. Why would Mark impart such a detail, unless perhaps he was giving his readers another flag, pointing them toward his source, the Odyssey? And when he was come out of the ship, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. And when Jesus was passed over again by ship unto the other side, much people gathered unto him, and he was nigh unto the sea. And they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And when the evening was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. And when they got out of the ship, the people immediately recognized him. And straightway he entered into a ship with his disciples, and came into the parts of Dalmanutha. And he left them, and entering into the ship again, departed to the other side. In no other gospel does Jesus do so much sailing. The question I have is, where did Jesus procure such large ships at precisely the locations and moments he needed them? Surely even his poor fisherman disciples didn't have so many large ships that could accommodate 13 men just sitting around waiting for Jesus to need them. And Mark treats the Sea of Galilee as if it was the Mediterranean, huge, deep, mysterious, prone to violent storms, large enough to capsize a boat with 13 men in it. Obviously, Mark had never even been to Palestine. The Sea of Galilee is more like a lake. Perhaps an elegant answer to this strange seafaring Jesus we find in Mark's story is that Mark was simply copying Odysseus's mode of transportation, which would explain the other little ships as well as the fact that Jesus even had a ship large enough for 13 men. And the parallels don't stop! I'm saving the best for last. Of course, in the next couple of vids, I'll be cooking up a mess of vittles you won't want to miss. Oh, and don't worry about the tab. It's all on me. Hey everyone, TruthSurge here. Yes, I'm appearing in my own video series. Alright, I wanted to show up now and clear something up. It seems like some people have assumed that this Homeric stuff was my original idea and my original research, and it's not. It comes from a book by Dennis R. MacDonald called The Homeric Epics in the Gospel of Mark. It's a brilliant book. If you haven't read it, you've got to read it if you're interested in Christian origins. MacDonald is a PhD in New Testament studies. He teaches at a university, yada, yada, yada. He's really a smart guy, and he's written another article or book on the Acts of Andrew along these same lines, and he's got 2 more books coming out soon. And so anyway, I wanted to clear this up because I don't want people to think that somehow I did all this. I'm just presenting it in my own words and in my own way. So, I'm only going to present one parallel in this video, but it's a doozy. So, without further hesitation, roll it, Johnny! What's your name? What's in a name? A rose by any other name would smell as sweet, according to some old, crusty English guy. I forget his name. Oh, it doesn't matter. Before we're done with this parallel, we'll find out just how important a name can be. In the Odyssey, a wise woman named Euryclea washes Odysseus's feet. Euryclea, who thought she was being kind to a stranger, suddenly recognizes her master from a scar on his leg. She loses her grip on his leg and his foot falls into the basin, spilling water onto the floor. They talk some more, and then she finishes the wash and anoints him with oil. In Mark, an apparently wise woman somehow recognizes an apparent stranger as Jesus, the Son of God, and somehow knew that he was not long on this earth. She anointed him with costly ointment after breaking the container open. The disciples complain about the wasted ointment, but Jesus commends the woman's act and claims that because of it, she would gain worldwide fame wherever the gospel was preached. If Mark was remembering the Euryclea scene when he penned his own anointing scene, it provides an elegant and simple explanation for 2 oddities that we find in Mark's scene. First, why the woman would need to break an alabaster box to get at the costly spikenard inside, and second, how an anonymous woman could possibly gain worldwide fame. The breaking of the alabaster box is parallel to the spilling of the water onto the floor in Homer's scene. In both cases, there is a recognition of who the hero really is, followed by a spilling of a substance, though not explicitly depicted in Mark's version. And both scenes include an anointing of the hero. Incidentally, both Matthew and Luke delete the part about the woman breaking the alabaster box. Now, this may seem like a rather weak parallel as it stands, but there are 2 stunning clues that Mark indeed copied this scene to create his own anointing scene, and these 2 clues will defy the claim of mere coincidence. Clue number 1. In the Odyssey, just after Euryclea anoints Odysseus, they discuss the treachery of the suitors and the servants who sided with the suitors. When heaven has delivered the suitors into your hand, I will give you a list of the women in the house who have been ill-behaved and of those who are guiltless. Here is the chronology of Homer's scene. A woman washing the hero. A recognition by the woman of the hero's true identity. The spilling of water onto the floor. An anointing of the hero with oil. And an immediate transition to a view of the suitors and the unfaithful servants. In Mark, just after Jesus is anointed by the woman, Mark also immediately and abruptly transitions to a treacherous view of his antagonists, the chief priests, and the unfaithful servant, Judas. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she hath done shall be spoken of for a memorial of her. And Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went unto the chief priests to betray him unto them. The scene change in Mark is abrupt and unnatural, but it matches the chronology from Homer's scene perfectly. Judas, who had served Jesus faithfully up to that point, was now siding with the suitors. The chief priests. Now, let's do a side-by-side and compare Mark and Homer with the scene transition added in. There is a woman and a hero. A recognition of the hero's true identity. The spilling of a substance onto the floor. An anointing of the hero. And the abrupt scene change to the hero's enemies and the unfaithful servant or servants. What is the likelihood that both anointing scenes would match up with a recognition, spilling of a substance, an anointing of the hero, and then transition immediately at the exact spot to a view of the hero's enemies and the betrayal by a trusted insider? Still not convinced? I told you there were 2 clues. Now for the final clue that will leave no doubt that Mark was indeed copying from the Euryclea scene. Clue number 2. Let's recall the woman who anointed Jesus with the costly ointment. Though anonymous in Mark's story, somehow she would not remain anonymous but would be remembered far and wide for her selfless act. Truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her. This seems rather strange. How would an unnamed woman become known worldwide? What would people remember her as? That woman that anointed Jesus? It just seems odd to me that Mark would not supply us with her name. But the key to explaining this oddity and proof that Mark was copying from the Odyssey lies in the meaning of the name of the anonymous woman's counterpart, Euryclea. The anonymous woman in Mark's story would gain far-flung glory for anointing Jesus. In Greek, Euryclea means, what's in a name? Apparently, more than we realized. That's all for now, but in the next couple of vids, it's going to get even more real. I'll examine even more amazing parallels and explain more oddities of Mark in the process. Veli Vistanu, that's Telugu for
I'll be back.
As we continue to examine the idea that Mark copied from Homer, let's consider Mark the author. Was it important for Mark that his readers got his Homeric parallels? It seems so. Mark seems to have provided a few fairly obvious flags for his readers to let them know to look for Homeric parallels. One of these flags can be found just before the anointing scene we covered in the last video. Jesus speaks about his own second coming in language that is suspiciously similar to the Odyssey's main plot. It is like a man away on a journey who, upon leaving his house and putting his slaves in charge, assigning to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming. This is exactly what happens in the Odyssey. Odysseus leaves his home on a journey, fights in the Trojan War, and spends another 16 years just trying to get back home. He leaves his servants in charge and eventually does come home disguised as a beggar, only to find treachery with the suitors vying for Penelope's hand in marriage, since they all think he's died on his journey. And some of Odysseus's servants had switched sides and become traitors and betrayers, thinking that he was never going to return. This is exactly parallel to the warning in Mark's parable. Be on the alert. The master could return home at any time. Be faithful. Keep watching. It seems that another of Mark's goals was to create a text that carried multiple parallels. This parable by Jesus also contains parallels to the betrayal by Peter and the sleeping servants we find in the Garden of Gethsemane. The rooster crowing is not only a parallel, but a foreshadowing of Peter's denial. Foreshadowing is a literary technique to clue the reader in to watch for this or that later on in the story. It is not how someone would record history. The reference to sleeping is also a foreshadowing of the sleeping disciples while Jesus prays in the garden, sleeping when they should have been keeping watch. The parable's more direct application also applies as Mark, through the mouth of Jesus, was warning Christians of his day to stay faithful until Jesus appeared on earth to judge everyone. It seems that the more parallels you could cram into one scene, the better. In the story of the Odyssey, the suitors are literally devouring Odysseus's house, or we could say Penelope's house, since she had lived there for 16 years without a husband, and whom the suitors believed to be a widow.
Woman, bring us more wine.
They were pillaging her goods and vying for the best spots at the banquets when they should have been acting civilized. Mark gives his readers yet another Homeric flag to alert them that his story is taking a clue from the greatest story of his day. In his teaching, he was saying, beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and like respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses. Is this just another coincidence or another flag Mark has given his readers? Surely Mark was casting the Jewish religious leaders into the role of the suitors for Penelope and the foil for Odysseus. Every hero needs his nemesis, and Mark is deliberately giving his readers hints that they should view the scribes in the same light as the treacherous suitors in the Odyssey. Speaking of banquets, did you ever notice in Mark's feeding of the 5,000 that there were no women and children present? I didn't either. It's easy to overlook. Here's the verse in question. And they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. Why is this a problem? The Greek used here is the Greek word for the male gender, anaer, which is used to distinguish a man from a woman, and is not the same as anthropos, which means man in the sense of human being. We see Mark using anthropos just 30 verses prior to the feeding miracle. And they went out and preached that men should repent. Should we believe that Mark meant that only men should repent? No, of course not. The word in verse 12 is anthropos, which means mankind or human beings. If Mark had intended the feeding miracle to include men and women and children, he would have just left off the word aner altogether. That Mark intended to mean only men were at the feeding miracle is certainly corroborated by Matthew, who interpreted the verse in precisely this way and found it highly improbable that huge crowds of only men would be present if people from all the surrounding areas had come to see Jesus, so he promptly edited Mark's account to explicitly include women and children as well. And they that did eat were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So there can be no debate about what is being said here. 5,000 men, and men only. And further, assuming the crowd did have women and children, it would make no sense for Mark to refer to the crowd as a whole as aner, which always denotes male gender. Matthew knew that this made little sense, so he clarified it in his version. Further, a huge crowd of men only seems a bit contrived given that women were also following Jesus around in other scenes. Remember the woman with the issue of blood. But the real oddity is that if we read a few verses before this one, you'd have to assume that men, women, and children rushed out of the cities and gathered around Jesus to hear him preach. The people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Are we to assume that only men ran from all the cities, waiting to hear and see Jesus? Would Mark not be able to simply say, those that ate were 5,000, period, without adding that they were all men? Clearly, Mark meant what he wrote. So how can we account for the magical transformation from a normal crowd of people to men only? Again, knowing Mark's source or sources is key to understanding why his tale seems so conflicting. Mark surely based the feeding of the 5,000 in part upon a scene from the Old Testament, as well as the Odyssey, and this has introduced the problem of men only. In the Old Testament, Elisha feeds 100 men and men only, which by itself would explain why Mark chose to feed men only. But is there something in the Odyssey from which Mark could have also drawn that would not only explain the men only part, but the quantity of men fed? Rather than paraphrase it, I'll read Dennis R. MacDonald's explanation from page 86 of his book, The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark, from which all of my Homer Mark info has been derived. When Telemachus and Athena arrived at Pylos, they witnessed a feast to Poseidon on the shore, at which the celebrants sat divided into 9 units, and 500 men were in each, 4,500. Later, the poet makes it clear that at this feast, only the men of Pylos participated. The male-only party in Homer presumably is due to the nature of the feast, a sacrifice by sailors to secure favorable weather and seas from Poseidon. The 5,000 whom Jesus served at the shore of the Sea of Galilee likewise were exclusively male. Mark gives no justification for the presence only of men. Matthew added women and children. The correlations of disembarkations at shores and the feedings of 4,500 or 5,000 men are not accidental. They are Markan flags. Homer's second feast at Menelaus's Sparta was lavish but presumably smaller, and because it was a wedding feast, it included women. Similarly, the crowd in Mark's second meal, though substantial, is smaller than at the first, and it, like the Spartan wedding, seems to have included women. Well, that wraps up this video. I had planned on touching on the parallels between Odysseus's crew members and Jesus's crew members, but instead I'll leave that one for you to do as homework and call this video done. I've got 2 more parallels I want to show you before we wrap up this entire section on Mark copying from Homer and Greek mythology. If you don't watch any other video in this section, You must watch the next one. It's gonna hit you like a bolt of lightning. See you there. Strange oddities abound throughout Mark's tale. But these oddities become clear once we are able to find Mark's source material. And now, grab your popcorn and dim the lights. I present to you the strange case of the inseparable James and John. The disciples, James and John, are said to be brothers, the sons of a man named Zebedee. They were, according to Mark, sailors and fishermen. Except for one verse, they are always referred to together and in the same order. Never John and James, always James and John. And going on a little further, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother. And straightway, when they were come out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. And James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James. And he suffered no man to follow with him, save Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And after 6 days, Jesus taketh with him Peter, and James and John. And there come near unto him James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And when the 10 heard it, they began to be moved with indignation concerning James and John. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives, over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately. And he taketh with him Peter and James and John. In fact, James is never referred to by himself in the entire gospel, always with John, and John is referred to only once by himself. Mark treats the brothers as if they were one person, not two individuals, always together, and even speaking as one person. James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." So, why is Mark treating the brothers as if they were Siamese twins, joined at the hip? Why the lack of individuality? Mark gives Peter a special place of prominence by having Jesus tell him that his church would be built upon him, and of the big 3 disciples, Peter is given preference in each scene. It is Peter who recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. It is Peter who speaks up at the Transfiguration. It is Peter who most fervently swears his fealty to his master, but, tragically, fails to keep his promise. Perhaps Mark was simply downplaying the importance of James and John in order to give Peter the title of top disciple. Or perhaps Mark was simply unaware of any details about James and John. Maybe the eldest brother was always referred to first. But I think there's a more powerful explanation which will not only illuminate this treatment of the brothers, but explain some oddities as well, and one verse that has remained a mystery since Mark penned it almost 2,000 years ago. This is a relief showing 2 young lads with horses. You can see that the sculptor has rendered them as mirror images to reinforce the idea that they were not only brothers, but twins. They are 2 characters from Greek mythology. Their names are Castor and Polydeuces. They are often depicted with horses and almost always depicted together. The mythology of these 2 varies, but over time they became viewed as divine and were thought to appear on the rigging of ships in the form of St. Elmo's fire, and were believed to indicate the safe escape from the upcoming storm. This poem from the Homeric hymns, a collection of ancient hymns to the various Greek gods, recounts the basics of the myth. I'll explain it in a little detail, so don't worry if it all seems confusing at first. Bright-eyed muses, tell of the Tyndaridae, the sons of Zeus, glorious children of neat-ankled Leda, Castor, the tamer of horses, and blameless Polydeuces. When Leda had lain with the dark-clouded son of Cronos, she bare them beneath the peak of the great hill Taygetus, children who are deliverers of men on earth, and of swift-going ships when the stormy gales rage over the ruthless sea. Then the shipmen call upon the sons of great Zeus with vows of white lambs, going to the forepart of the prow, but the strong wind and the waves of the sea lay the ship under water, until suddenly these two are seen darting through the air on tawny wings. Forthwith they allay the blasts of the cruel winds, and still the waves upon the surface of the white sea. Fair signs are they, and deliverance from toil. And when the shipmen see them, they are glad, and have rest from their pain and labor. The Tyndaridae was another name for Castor and Polydeuces, as Castor was fathered by Tyndareus. The other title used for the twins is sons of Zeus, as Polydeuces was considered to have been fathered by Zeus. One legend says that Zeus, disguised as a swan, raped Leda, and she laid 4 eggs and gave birth to Castor and Polydeuces, as well as Helen and Clytemnestra. Castor and Clytemnestra were thought to be Tyndareus' son and daughter, and they were mortal, while Polydeuces and Helen were thought to be Zeus's son and daughter and immortal. So you'll find Castor and Polydeuces referred to sometimes as the sons of Tyndareus, or the Tyndaridae, but more times than not as the Dioscuri, literally Zeus's boys. Castor and Polydeuces are sometimes both mortal, sometimes both divine, but the more well-known tale has Castor being mortal and Polydeuces being immortal. And in the myth, Castor is eventually killed. As a result, Polydeuces then splits half his immortality with his fallen brother, so that Castor spends half his time on Mount Olympus and half of his time in Hades, as does Polydeuces. The brothers became part of the stellar constellation Gemini, which is Latin for twins, becoming the 2 brightest stars in the group, Castor, or Alpha Geminorum, and Pollux, which is the Latin name for Polydeuces, Beta Geminorum. The question is, was Mark mimicking the common and widespread Greek myth of the Dioscuri by depicting James and John as a Christianized version of Castor and Polydeuces, inseparable and indistinct, mirror images of each other? And in the same way James and John are always referred to in the same order, Castor and Polydeuces were never called Polydeuces and Castor, always Castor and Polydeuces. But here is where it gets interesting. Remember the scene where James and John asked to sit at the left and right hand of Jesus? James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory." Did you notice how neither of them seemed to care whether they actually got the left or the right position, even though the right position was normally associated with a higher place of honor? Sitting at the right hand of a deity would have been the best seat in the house, but according to Mark, neither John nor James showed the slightest interest in the right position. Again, they are depicted as one person, instead of two distinct brothers who we know would have been fighting over that right-hand spot, Mark has given us another Homeric flag in this passage. The brothers are requesting to flank Jesus at the left and the right, a deity flanked by twins. The twins, Castor and Polydeuces, are seen in these images as flanking a deity, one of the brothers on the left and one on the right. Here, they are seen with Helen of Troy, who is believed to be the daughter of Zeus and as such a demigod or immortal. Another depicts them at the left and right of Zeus. And here are two instances where the Dioscuri flank Astarte. In this picture, they flank Serapis. This image shows them flanking Saturn. And here is one where they flank Jupiter. And here is another where they flank Jupiter. And here is another showing the twins at the left and right of Artemis. And one more showing them flanking Artemis. And this one is perhaps Heracles. And one with Helios. And here is another showing them at the left and right hand of Juno. Castor and Polydeuces, the Dioscuri, flanking various deities. This would explain why Mark depicted John and James as twins, requesting to flank a deity, with no care as to which side was which. It appears that Mark was indeed superimposing the well-known myth of Castor and Polydeuces onto James and John, and inventing the details based on the mythology, rather than giving us actual historical events. But there's one final oddity that I've deliberately saved for last. It is another Homeric flag by Mark, and this time an explicit one that none of his readers could have missed. And it only appears in the Gospel of Mark. For Mark's readers, it was a very important flag early on in his story so that they would not miss his reference to the mythological twins. And James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, and he surnamed them Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder. The twins, Castor and Polydeuces, were known collectively as the Dioscuri, which means the sons of Zeus. Zeus was known as the god of thunder and the thundering one, and Zeus's father, Kronos, was known as the father of thunder. Castor and Polydeuces, the Dioscuri, or literally Zeus's boys. Mark has given his readers an easy flag with which to recognize his Christianized version of the Dioscuri in his own work. James and John, the sons of thunder, Zeus's boys, the mythical Greek twins known as the Dioscuri. I'd like to tell you one final parallel concerning James and John and Castor and Polydeuces. It's interesting to know that James was thought to have been martyred, and John was believed to have been immortal by some early Christians. Castor, James's counterpart, was mortal and was killed by the sword just like James. Polydeuces was immortal, just like John was believed to be. And lastly, remember when James and John asked Jesus, collectively, to sit at his right and left hand in his glory, and Jesus replied to them that it wasn't his to give them, and that it would be given to them for whom it had been prepared. Now, remember the thieves on the cross? One on his left and one on his right. That's a literary author at work, foreshadowing, fiction flowing from the pen of Mark. James and John could not share Jesus' death as they and all the others would forsake him. But instead, Jesus shares his moment of glory with two common criminals, which would spark the reader's memory about what Jesus had told James and John earlier. His right and left were not his to give. And now, like any good carpenter, we need to put the final nail into this Homer Mark coffin, a final parallel, which I'm sure is mere coincidence. In the Odyssey, we learn that Odysseus was quite the tekton. That's ancient Greek for craftsman, someone skilled at making things out of basic supplies. Odysseus built the famed Trojan horse and the bed in his home, which included a complete tree trunk. He made this for his new wife Penelope, as well as a room to enclose the bed. While shipwrecked on the Isle of Ogygia, the home of Calypso, Odysseus built a raft in order to sail away and escape. Homer goes into great detail about just how Odysseus constructed these items, and clearly wanted to depict Odysseus as a very skilled tekton. What are the odds that of all the vocations Jesus could have had, he would be a tekton just like Odysseus? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judah and Simon? And just in case you're wondering what the Greek word translated as carpenter really is, here's a look at the actual manuscript from the earliest known complete Bible in existence. And the Greek word rendered as carpenter is tekton. And with this, the final nail in the coffin has been placed. There is, in my mind, simply no way Mark could have recorded actual events in the life of Jesus, which also just happened to parallel this many events of a character in a fictional story written 800 years earlier. The only answer that makes sense is that Mark copied from the Odyssey, the Iliad, and Greek mythology, as did many other writers of fiction in the ancient Greco-Roman world. All of this and much more can be found in Dennis R. MacDonald's fantastic book, The Homeric Epics and the Gospel of Mark. I want to thank Dr. MacDonald also for sending me the images of the Dioscuri coins and sculptures, as I was having a bit of trouble finding those with a generic Google search. This concludes the section on Mark's reliance upon Greek mythology, and again, the impact upon the question of the resurrection cannot be overstated. If Mark contains multiple fictional scenes, and Mark is our earliest gospel, and Matthew, John, Luke, and Acts depend on the written text of Mark, well, you do the math. In the next section, we'll look at the ending of the original story Mark did write and see if perhaps even the empty tomb scene can be traced back to a common literary motif. See you then.